October 24th, 1943, east of the Azores, somewhere in the North Atlantic. Commander Peter Szech had been underwater for hours while British destroyers worked above him. His crew sat in near darkness, listening to the impacts get closer. The boat groaned under the pressure of each detonation. Water dripped from new fractures in the casing. The lights flickered. It was not his first depth charge attack. It was his worst. And somewhere in those hours, something inside Zik broke in a way that couldn't be repaired. He pulled a service pistol from his holster and shot himself in the head, in the control room, in front of his crew, while the depth charges were still falling. His first watch officer, Paul Meyer, was 26 years old. He'd never commanded a submarine. He took one look at his dead commander and gave the orders that kept the boat alive. He rode out the rest of the attack, brought the boat back to Lorient on November 7th, and reported what had happened. Peter Szech became the first, and so far only, commanding officer in naval history to commit suicide while in active command of a warship. Underwater, during battle, on a boat that survived. The boat was U-505, and this was not the first time it had nearly killed everyone aboard. Nor would it be the last. A submarine's ability to dive and surface isn't magic, it's mechanics, and like all mechanics, it can fail. The dive planes on a Type 7 or Type 9 U-boat were horizontal fins attached to the hull, one set at the bow, one at the stern. When angled downward, they drove the nose of the submarine deeper as it moved forward. When angled upward, they pushed the boat toward the surface. The crew in the control room operated them through hand wheels or electric motors, watching a depth gauge and maintaining whatever depth the commander ordered. Every practice dive started the same way. The commander gave the order. The diving officer relayed it. 2. Ratings at hand wheels on opposite sides of the control room began turning simultaneously. The man on the left responsible for bow planes, the man on the right for stern planes. Water flooded the ballast tanks. The boat nosed downward. The depth gauge moved. Everyone watched it. Training required that a U-boat reach periscope depth in under 30 seconds from the moment the alarm was sounded. Combat experience showed that 30 seconds was sometimes too long. Allied aircraft could release a bomb and watch it hit the water in less time than that. The drill was repeated until it was automatic, until the crew could execute the crash dive half asleep and in complete darkness, until the men at the plane wheels turned them without thinking about it. That automaticity was the point. In a crash dive, there was no time to think. The planes had to move on reflex. The boat had to respond immediately. The crew trusted that when they turned the wheels, the planes moved, because the alternative, that the wheels might turn and nothing happen, was not something you could afford to dwell on while the alarm was sounding. It worked every time, until it didn't. A near-miss depth charge detonation could buckle the external mechanism that connected the control wheels inside to the planes outside. It could jam the linkage in whatever position the planes occupied at the moment of the blast. It could flood the electrical motors that drove them. It could bend the planes themselves so they no longer responded to control inputs at all. If the bow planes jammed in the dive position while the boat was underwater, the front of the submarine kept driving downward, regardless of what the crew did with the control wheels. The engines pushing the boat forward became the enemy. Stopping the engines helped, but if the planes were locked at a steep enough angle and the boat was already deep, stopping wasn't enough. The boat fell. Type 7 U-boats had a tested operating depth of around 230 meters. Their theoretical crush depth, the point at which hull pressure exceeded what the steel could bear, was somewhere around 250 to 300 meters, depending on the boat's condition. Depth charges could degrade hull integrity well before they jammed the planes. A boat that had already taken hits might reach structural failure at a much shallower depth than a fresh boat from the shipyard. The men operating dive planes understood this math. They'd been trained on it. What the training couldn't prepare them for was the experience of watching the depth gauge needle move past safe operating depth, while the control wheels did nothing. The basic depth charge problem was this: a near miss that didn't sink the submarine directly could disable the systems that kept the submarine under control. Close enough to damage, not close enough to destroy. This was in some ways worse than a direct kill. Allied escort crews figured out early that you didn't have to hold the hull to kill a submarine. A pattern of depth charges set to explode at different depths created a zone of hydraulic shock that propagated through the water in all directions. A submarine inside that zone experienced it as a series of violent impacts. Not against the hull directly, but against everything mechanical attached to the hull. The hydroplanes were particularly vulnerable. They projected outside the pressure hull. They moved on external shafts that could be bent. The linkages connecting them to interior control systems ran through fittings that could be sheared. The electric motors driving them sat in spaces that could flood. On U-505 on June 4, 1944, the depth charge pattern from the destroyer Escort. Chatelain punched a hole in the outer hull, threw the crew around the control room, killed lights and electrical machinery, and jammed the rudder hard over to starboard. The boat went into an uncontrolled dive that took her to 755 feet, more than 230 meters, past her tested operating depth, the kind of depth where hull rivets began weeping and bulkheads groaned under pressure that wasn't supposed to be there. Commander Harold Lang brought her up using compressed air in the ballast tanks, and what control surfaces still responded. She surfaced 700 yards from the ship that had just attacked her. The rudder was still jammed. The boat circled clockwise at 7 knots, unable to steer. The crew abandoned her in the water while she continued her circle. The whole sequence from depth charging to surfacing had taken less than 7 minutes. But that was June 1944. Go back 9 months, and you find a different crew on the same boat, facing the same situation with a different outcome. Shech had taken U-505 out on patrol exactly 14 days before he died. It was his 7th patrol as commander. The previous 6 had ended without him ever reaching the operational zone, every single time forced back to port by mechanical failure caused by French resistance sabotage of the Lorient dockyard. The sabotage was so systematic, defective welds, bad valves, components rigged to fail, that several French workers were shot for it. None of it stopped the sabotage. It continued patrol after patrol. At Lorient, jokes circulated about U-505. The men berthed alongside her had a saying: "There is one commander who will always come back. Shech." It wasn't a compliment. In 14 months in command, Shech had spent only 96 days at sea. He'd sunk one ship, the British merchant Ocean Justice off South America. 7,173 tons. No casualties on the target vessel. That was his entire combat record. On October 10th, he finally got clear of the Bay of Biscay. 14 days later, east of the Azores, British destroyers found him. The depth charging that followed was long and concentrated. Hans Gerbeler, a control room mechanic on U-505, later described the experience of riding out depth charge attacks in his memoir, Steelboat, Iron Hearts. You sit in darkness or near darkness because running electrical systems draws down the batteries and creates heat. You hear the detonations, some far away, dull impacts you feel through the hull, others close enough to throw men off their feet and shatter instrument gauges. Water intrudes in places it shouldn't. The pressure hull creaks under depth it wasn't designed to absorb. Shech had experienced this before. He'd survived it before. Something in this attack was different. The duration, perhaps. The accuracy of the pattern. The accumulated weight of 14 months of failed patrols and sabotage and mechanical breakdowns and jokes he wasn't supposed to know about, but did. He reached into his holster and shot himself with a Walther PPK pistol. Paul Meyer took command in the middle of an ongoing depth charge attack with his dead commander on the control room floor and a crew watching to see what he'd do. He was 26 years old. He'd been a first watch officer, not a commander. He did what a commander does. He gave orders. He waited. He evaded. He brought the boat home. The Kriegsmarine investigated. Meyer was not commended for restoring order under impossible circumstances. He was formally absolved of blame, which was the naval bureaucracy's way of saying they didn't know what to do with what had happened. Sheikh was buried quietly. The story of how he died was classified. Dönitz decided against disbanding U-505's crew, fearing what it would do to fleet morale if the story spread. It spread anyway. Imagine you're at depth in the Atlantic, riding out a depth charge attack. The control room is red-lit or dark. Every man at his station doing exactly what the training prescribed. You don't scream. You don't run. You sit still and listen to the ocean trying to find you. The depth gauge is a dial on the bulkhead. It reads current depth in meters. During a normal dive, you watch it move to operating depth and stabilize. During an evasion, you watch it move deliberately as you change depth to make the escort's job harder. Both of these are things you control. When the planes jam and the needle begins moving on its own, without any command from anyone, past operating depth and still moving, that's a different experience entirely. You're turning wheels that do nothing. You're watching a number that represents the difference between your structural integrity and the pressure of the water outside, and it's going the wrong direction, and nothing you do changes it. Herbert Werner, who served as first watch officer on U-612 before it was rammed in a training accident in the Baltic in August 1942, described in his memoir, Iron Coffins, how mechanical failures during diving and surfacing could transform a crew's relationship with their boat. 2 men died in that collision with U-444. Werner witnessed it. The boat was eventually raised and used for training. The crew went on, but Werner's account captures how quickly the submarine that felt protective and powerful could become a trap. Herbert Werner, who served as first watch officer on U-612 before it was rammed in a training accident in the Baltic in August 1942, described in his memoir, Iron Coffins, how mechanical failures during diving and surfacing could transform a crew's relationship with their boat. 2 men died in that collision with U-444. Werner witnessed it. The boat was eventually raised and used for training. The crew went on. But Werner's account captures how quickly the submarine that felt protective and powerful could become a trap. Consider what it smelled like. By the time a U-boat had been submerged for 12 hours, the air inside had changed noticeably. Carbon dioxide accumulated. As the crew breathed and the scrubbers strained to keep pace, the smell of diesel fumes never fully cleared. Sweat and mildew and machine oil. Condensation ran down the inner hull and pooled on the decking. 50 men in a steel tube, 200 feet beneath the Atlantic, were generating a specific kind of sensory overload that had to be managed alongside the operational demands. Depth charge attacks added to all of this. The detonations created pressure waves that affected the inner ear. Close detonations produced a physical sensation in the body. Not pain exactly, but the feeling of being grabbed and shaken. Instrument gauges shattered. Light bulbs blew. The emergency lighting, red-tinted, dim, gave the interior a quality that crewmen consistently described in their post-war accounts as nightmarish. The men who operated the hydroplanes, usually ratings in the control room, sitting at wheels on opposite sides of the compartment responsible for bow planes and stern planes, respectively, trained for exactly this failure mode. They knew what to do when the planes stopped responding. They knew the emergency procedures. They rehearsed them. The rehearsal couldn't prepare you for the gauge needle moving past 200 meters while the wheels do nothing, while depth charges detonate above you, while you can hear the water finding new paths inside the hull. Some men handled it, some didn't. Some boats came back and some didn't, and often the difference between the two outcomes was narrower than anyone in the submarine service liked to admit. Of the approximately 39,000 men who served in the German submarine service during the Second World War, around 28,000 died. 7 out of 10. The highest casualty rate of any branch of any military in the conflict. Think about what that means for a crew of 50 men. 35 of them, on average, did not come home. The math wasn't theoretical. Every man on a U-boat in 1943 knew the numbers. They'd watched the boats from their flotilla not return. They'd seen the berthing spaces fill up with new faces who had replaced men who were at the bottom of the Atlantic. They understood that the statistical probability was that they would die in their submarine. Think about what that means for a crew of 50 men. 35 of them, on average, did not come home. The math wasn't theoretical. Every man on a U-boat in 1943 knew the numbers. They'd watched the boats from their flotilla not return. They'd seen the berthing spaces fill up with new faces who had replaced men who were at the bottom of the Atlantic. They understood that the statistical probability was that they would die in their submarine. What made this knowledge livable, what allowed men to function with it, was a belief in the machinery. The submarine was dangerous, but the submarine was also their protection. The steel hull between them and the Atlantic was the thing that made the patrol survivable. The diving planes, the ballast tanks, the pressure hull itself, these were the systems that kept the crew alive when everything outside the hull was trying to kill them. When depth charges jammed the dive planes, that relationship inverted. The machine that was supposed to be protecting you was now driving you deeper, past the tolerances the engineers had certified, past the depth where the hull rivets had been tested to hold. The ocean wasn't attacking you from outside anymore. Your own boat was delivering you into it. Most of them kept going out anyway. This is the part of the U-boat war that resists easy explanation. Not the tactics, not the technology. Those are well documented. The part that's harder to understand is why men continued to sail into a 50-50 or worse chance of death, patrol after patrol, until the math finally caught up with them. The answer, as far as anyone can reconstruct it from memoirs and interrogation, records, had several components. Unit loyalty. The men in your boat were the men keeping you alive, and abandoning them wasn't possible. Military discipline. The orders came and you followed them. And something harder to name, a kind of professional commitment to the work of operating a submarine well, independent of the odds of survival. What depth charge damage to dive planes represented was a particular category of threat inside that framework. Being depth charged was something you trained for. Being hit was something you could respond to. But when the planes jammed and the boat took you deeper than physics would tolerate, the professional training stopped being relevant. You'd done everything right. The machinery had failed. The ocean was doing the rest. U-505 is the best documented case of depth charge-induced loss of depth control because she survived to tell the story. Most boats that went too deep didn't surface. The records show them as lost to unknown causes, or failed to return, or, in the more honest assessments, possibly lost to depth charge damage in the following area. When a submarine exceeded crush depth, it happened fast. The progressive failure of the pressure hull under increasing water pressure was not a slow process. Rivet heads sheared. Welds that had held for years under normal operating pressure failed simultaneously across a section of hull. Water entered under enormous pressure. The rate of flooding was measured in seconds per compartment, not minutes. The crew in those compartments died before they had time to respond. The records do not, in most cases, distinguish between sank from depth charges detonating close enough to hold the hull directly, and sank from depth charges that damaged control systems, causing loss of depth control. Both appear simply as sunk by depth charges. The distinction matters because in the first case, the boat died from the weapon. In the second case, the boat killed itself, in a sense, driven past its own limits by mechanisms that were supposed to protect it, but had been turned against it. U-505 is the best documented case of depth charge-induced loss of depth control because she survived to tell the story. Most boats that went too deep didn't surface. The records show them as lost to unknown causes, or failed to return, or, in the more honest assessments, possibly lost to depth charge damage in the following area. When a submarine exceeded crush depth, it happened fast. The progressive failure of the pressure hull under increasing water pressure was not a slow process. Rivet heads sheared. Welds that had held for years under normal operating pressure failed simultaneously across a section of hull. Water entered under enormous pressure. The rate of flooding was measured in seconds per compartment, not minutes. The crew in those compartments died before they had time to respond. None of the boats that went too deep sent a signal explaining what happened. There was no record of the moment the hull failed. There was no survivor account. The boat was simply not at the rendezvous point when expected, and then it was not in the following week's reports. And then it was listed as overdue, and then it was listed as lost. Families received telegrams. The space at the Lorient dockside where the boat had berthed was reassigned. The records do not, in most cases, distinguish between sank from depth charges detonating close enough to hold the hull directly, and sank from depth charges that damaged control systems, causing loss of depth control. Both appear simply as sunk by depth charges. The distinction matters because in the first case, the boat died from the weapon. In the second case, the boat killed itself, in a sense, driven past its own limits by mechanisms that were supposed to protect it, but had been turned against it. U-1206 offers a different category of depth control failure, one that could not be trained for because the threat didn't exist before the technology did. Commissioned in March 1944, Type 7C, Commander Karl Adolf Schlitt was 27 years old. The boat was fitted with one of the new high-pressure toilets developed to allow the submarine to use its facilities at depth rather than storing waste on board. It was an innovation. It saved weight and space. It also required a specially trained operator. Each crew member was supposed to receive instruction before using it. The procedure was genuinely complicated, a specific sequence of valves that had to be operated in the right order, with allowances made for current depth. On April 14, 1945, Schlitt used the toilet without calling for the operator. He couldn't figure out the flush mechanism. He called for a technician. The technician misunderstood the situation and opened the wrong valve. Seawater flooded the forward compartment and reached the battery bank directly below the toilet, where it reacted with the battery acid to produce chlorine gas. The boat had no choice but to surface immediately in the North Sea, 8 miles off Peterhead on the Scottish coast. Royal Air Force aircraft found her. Schlitt ordered the boat scuttled. 4 men died. 46 were captured, including Schlitt, who was taken to the Peterhead police station where he surrendered his weapon. This was April 14, 1945. Germany surrendered on May 7. Schlitt's crew spent the last 23 days of the war as prisoners. What connects U-1206 to the broader story of dive plane failures isn't the specific cause. A toilet is not a dive plane. It's the principle. In both cases, the mechanism that was supposed to keep the crew alive in their hostile environment became the thing that killed them. The engineering that extended a submarine's capability past what previous submarines could do also created new ways to fail, and failure underwater in 1942 or 1944 or 1945 meant the same thing. By mid-1943, German submarine headquarters understood that mechanical casualties, boats lost to their own systems rather than directly to enemy action, were a real and growing portion of overall losses. Training accidents alone accounted for a significant number of boats. The Baltic training program, where new crews drilled the skills they'd need in the Atlantic, produced casualties every year. Collisions during exercises, boats that went too deep on practice dives with faulty depth gauges, equipment that worked perfectly in the shipyard and failed on the first operational dive. The boats, being commissioned in late 1943 and early 1944, were coming out of shipyards under increasing pressure to produce faster. The skilled workers who'd built the pre-war boats were not always available. Quality control suffered. Welds that would have been rejected in 1941 were being accepted in 1943. French resistance sabotage in the occupied dockyard towns added another layer of uncertainty. You couldn't always know, when you tested a system before departing on patrol, whether it had been correctly built or covertly damaged. Dönitz understood all of this. He kept sending the boats out anyway. The strategic situation left him no alternative that he was willing to accept. Germany needed the submarines to be in the Atlantic attacking convoys, even as the mathematics of that campaign grew progressively more unfavorable. He told his crews in a message on May 23, 1943, after Black May's losses of 41 submarines in a single month, that they faced difficult times and must endure them. He didn't tell them that the dive planes on their boats could jam if the depth charge pattern was accurate enough. He didn't tell them that the high-pressure toilets on the new boats required training they might not receive. He couldn't tell them that the probability of coming home from a 1944 Atlantic patrol was worse than 1 in 2. The crews generally knew the numbers anyway. They went out because they'd been ordered to, because their crewmates were counting on them, and because the alternative was something they couldn't articulate to themselves. U-1206 is still down there, about 86 meters down, 12 miles off the Aberdeenshire coast of Scotland, resting on a flat sandy bottom with a 45-degree list to port. Divers found it in 1970 when British petroleum workers laying a pipeline spotted something on the seabed. They didn't know immediately what it was. When they identified it as a German submarine, British Petroleum tracked down Karl Adolf Schlitt and brought him back to Scotland, where he met the fisherman who had pulled his crew out of the North Sea in April 1945. He gave them a plaque. He thanked them for saving his life. Divers rediscovered the wreck properly in 2012. They reported it in good condition for its age. The snorkel is still visible. The periscope and anti-aircraft guns were torn off by a trawling net sometime after the war, but they lie on the seabed nearby, tangled in the net. The hull is intact. Karl Adolf Schlitt died on April 7, 2009, aged 90. He outlived all of his crew. The high-pressure toilet that caused all of this is presumably still inside the wreck, 86 meters down, still connected to the valve that someone opened in the wrong order. 23 days before the war ended, on the first patrol the boat had ever made. The men who went down with U-505's uncontrolled dives, in October 1943 under Paul Meyer, in June 1944 under Harold Lang, mostly survived because the boats came back up. The men who went down on the boats that didn't surface left no record of what happened when the planes jammed past the point of recovery. They went too deep too fast. The cold water preserves things at that depth. Whatever is left of those boats and those crews will be there long after the last person who served in a U-boat is gone.